Thanks very much to the Oneida County History Center for inviting me. This is going to be a talk about family and ancestors, and I just want to begin by introducing a few people who are here. My husband Bob, my niece Holly, who grew up on the best land, and my kindred spirit, Becky Karst, who lives on the best land as well. Becky has this amazing, extraordinary collection of the history of Oneida families, which she shared with me over the years. And so she has sort of been my companion on this journey of discovery about the history of the best land. So it is wonderful to have her here. And I also want to recognize Dick Lynch, who is here. Dick also very generously shared with me his thoughts and feelings about growing up Oneida in Oneida. And so he and his ancestors are also very much a part of this story. So first, I should explain why I have written a book about the land I grew up on in Oneida. When I was a child on my family's farm, everything seemed so settled. And then when I was in high school in the 1970s, the Oneida Indians claimed that New York State had acquired their land illegally, and they won their cases in court. And I remember feeling conflicted about that because I thought the Oneidas were probably right, but I did not want to lose our family farm. So everything that had seemed so settled was now unsettled. So when I was in 7th grade social studies, like any of you who grew up in New York State, I learned that the Oneidas, along with the Mohawks, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, made up the Five Nations, or the Iroquois Confederacy, known as the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse, and that they were the original inhabitants. But they disappeared from our history books after the American Revolution. So I grew up thinking that Native people belonged in the past. But then here they were, asserting their sovereignty, their treaty rights, and their land claims. So I had these questions. What really happened here? And why didn't I know anything about it? And so years later, I decided to answer these questions by looking into the history of the farm I grew up on and the two families who had called it home. So I knew that my great-grandparents, Frank Brewer and Jenny Clement Brewer, had bought our farm from the grandchildren of Angel DeFerrier and Polly Denny DeFerrier, and that before that the land had belonged to the Oneidas. So I decided to trace my family of European settlers and Polly Denny's Mohawk Oneida family to find out about these people and how they came to live on the best land. So I once heard my grandfather call our farm the best land in Madison County. And he was referring to its flat, fertile fields. And as you can see in this picture, Quaslone Creek ran north through our farm on its way to Oneida Lake. Others considered this to be the best land because it was crossed by the most important east-west route in North America. So take a look at this image of the eastern United States provided by satellite. It shows that there's only one relatively flat route by land or water through the Appalachian mountain range. So people could travel up the Hudson River, through the Mohawk Valley, to Oneida Lake, and then reach the Great Lakes. The Haudenosaunee knew the power and importance of this place. For decades, the British and French fought for control of it. General George Washington considered it to be vital, and New York State could not wait to get its hands on it. So this route by water required a short portage between the Mohawk River and Wood Creek at what was called the Oneida Carrying Place, which is now present-day Rome. And this route by land crossed our farm. So on this aerial photograph, the main road west, which was called the Genesee Road, or later the Seneca Turnpike, or now Route 5, is just to the south of this picture. The New York Central Railroad ran in front of our house when I was a child, and then later it was moved to the back of our fields. The Erie Canal is right here, running through the back of our farm, and then to the north of it is the New York State Thruway. So this transportation route would transform Oneida Territory, New York State, and the United States. So let me give you an overview of how I answered those questions, what happened here, and why didn't I know anything about it. And what I'm going to do is try to cover about 400 years in 40 minutes, and then leave time for questions. So when I began my research, I read the journal written by Harman Vanden Bogart about his journey to Mohawk and Oneida Territory in 1634. Harman's journal is the earliest known written account of the Oneidas by a European. He had been sent to Oneida and Mohawk Territory to learn what he could about acquiring a greater share of the fur trade for his employer, the Dutch West India Company, that ran the colony of New Netherland, later New York. After I learned that Harman Vanden Bogart was my 9th great-grandfather, I read the journal again. It's possible that while he was traveling through Mohawk and Oneida Territory, he met Polly's ancestors, but I have no way of knowing that. So by the 1700s, my family and Polly's family lived in the Mohawk and Schoharie valleys. So my ancestors were Dutch, French, English, and German speakers. They learned native languages and served as go-betweens for colonists and the Haudenosaunee. Polly's mother was a Mohawk woman, and her father was a Frenchman who was taken captive and adopted by the Oneidas. So Polly was born in what is now Middleburg in Schoharie. She and her siblings spoke Mohawk, Oneida, and French at home, and Dutch, German, and English with the neighbors. Members of her family often served as interpreters. So my family and Polly's family during this time were the sort of people who served as links between native and newcomer communities. After the American Revolution, Polly's family moved to Oriska, or Oriskany, which is here. That is the easternmost Oneida town. And I want to explore this part of the story that takes place in what becomes Oneida County in more detail, because this is the place where the Oneidas first struggled to preserve their land from European takeover. Very early in the 1700s, rich investors claimed to have purchased what was called the Oriskany patent, and that included the carrying place and the nearby Oneida town of Oriska. Now, the Oneidas insisted that they never sold this place that was so important. And back in London, the British government recommended that this fraudulent Oriskany patent be overturned, but the colonial officials of New York, some of whom had invested in the Oriskany patent, failed to do that. Then later in the 1700s, the British government and native leaders negotiated a border between English and native territory called the Line of Property. And they negotiated it at a treaty council held at Fort Stanwix, which had been built to guard the carrying place. The Oneidas objected to this line because it ran through the middle of their territory, and it also placed the carrying place and Oriska on the British side of the line. So you can see the line here. Here's Oneida Castle, the main Oneida town, and here's Oriska and the carrying place. The Oneidas ultimately accepted this line after a lot of pressure and negotiation because the British officials agreed to share the carrying place, preserve Oriska as an Oneida town, and prevent white encroachment on their territory. The line of property did not work. Instead, it enhanced the resentment of British rule among the colonists, who already were furious about exceedingly unpopular taxes, and it failed to placate native people because settlers ignored the line and moved west anyway. When the American Revolution broke out, it placed the Haudenosaunee in an impossible dilemma. Even though many of their leaders preferred to stay out of the war, they knew it was coming to their territory. Most of the Haudenosaunee sided with the British. For example, most of the Mohawks of the Schoharie Valley chose to fight against the American rebels. But Polly's family chose to fight on the side of the Americans. The Oneidas made the momentous decision to side with the Americans against the British Empire. And they had many reasons for doing this, but one of the most important was that they believed that the British had failed to respect their territory, while General George Washington and the Continental Congress promised that the Oneidas' land would be respected. So at the Battle of Oriskany, Oneida warriors from Oriska joined the rebel militia, which included my ancestors. And together, they stood their ground against the invading British and native force. Okay, this artist's rendering of the battle shows the Oneida Wolf Clan war chief named Hanieri and his wife and son fighting at the Battle of Oriskany. And I should just mention that Hanieri is Becky's ancestor. The Oneidas later fought at the Battle of Saratoga, they fought at Valley Forge, and throughout the Revolution they defended the Mohawk Valley, including, I found out, the fortified home of my ancestors. And when the Revolution was over, and the United States pulled off a surprise victory, the grateful Americans promised by treaty that the Oneidas would be secure in the lands on which they were settled. New York State, however, was determined to act fast to take over native land. It wanted to extend its control over all Haudenosaunee territory and the main road west. So using pressure and deceit, The state acquired most of the Oneida's 6 million acres. The Oneidas of Oriska tried to hold on to their town. At treaty councils, they reminded officials of promises made by the U.S. government that their land would be preserved. They sent petitions. On this one, the leading men of Oriska closed out their petition by saying they pray that the honorable legislature will take measures to secure a title to them of their land that they possess. And it is signed by John Denny, Polly's brother, who put his Turtle Clan mark next to his name. It is signed by Hanyeri, Becky's ancestor, who put his mark next to his name. It is signed by the very distinguished warrior Cornelius Shagoyantha, who is Dick's ancestor, who put his mark next to his name. I don't know if the state replied to this petition, but I do know that after it was submitted, there's no record that the state replied, but after it was submitted, the Oneidas decided to go to New York City to meet the governor in person to ask that their land be secured to them. And the governor, who happened to be an investor in the discredited Oriskany patent, said that their land was no longer theirs. So I explain this because I want you to understand that when these Oneidas, including Polly's family, left Oriska to move and eventually settle on the best land, they would bring with them this bitter experience, but also of being promised first by the British, then by the Americans, and to have those promises and guarantees broken. But I also want to point out that by submitting these petitions and negotiating these treaties, they left us with this written record of their assertions of their rights and a record of the wrongdoing that was done. So, by the 1790s, the Oneidas had a 300,000 acre reservation left, which includes parts of Madison and Oneida, present-day Madison and Oneida counties. What you'll notice is that the Oneidas had hung on to the most important part of their territory, and that was the part crossed by the main road west. So here you can see where the Genesee Road crosses Oneida Creek. That's where what we call Oneida Castle, the main Oneida town, existed. Also in the 1790s, my ancestors moved to Oneida Territory. They settled south of the main road in the hills, and they were what were called squatters, which meant they were there illegally. Now, typically squatters are poor people who couldn't afford to buy land that was legally for sale. So they would take a gamble that if they cleared and farmed land, that they might have a first shot at buying it when it did come up for sale. So in other words, these squatters, like my ancestors, are counting on the state to obtain this land from the Oneidas. Now, Polly's family settled right in the middle of the reservation on the best land, which is here where Quaslone Creek crosses the main road. Now, her family was welcomed by the Oneidas as multilingual go-betweens. And also, they welcomed Polly's husband, who was a man named Angel de Ferrier. He was a Frenchman who had fled the French Revolution and settled on the New York frontier. So the Oneidas asked Angel DeFerrier to represent them at treaty councils when they went to Albany to negotiate these treaties of purchase of Oneida land by the state. Now most of these treaties, not all, but most of them were conducted illegally, because by federal law, treaties had to be signed by the President of the United States and ratified by Congress. But most of the time, New York State ignored that federal law. So in return for his services, the Oneidas and the state rewarded Angel with hundreds of acres of land, which he and Polly sold in lots to settlers. So when New York State decided it was going to build a canal to connect the Hudson River to Lake Erie, it needed one more piece of Oneida land, and that was the best land. So even though Oneida male and female leaders objected by this time to Angel DeFerrier's service as their agent, a group of Oneidas accompanied Angel to Albany, where they negotiated this treaty. This map of the first tract is the first survey of the best land. So you can see the turnpike, the Seneca Turnpike here, where it's crossed by Quaslone Creek. And the state built the canal through lots 2, 3, and 4. And when the canal was finished, the state rewarded Angel DeFerrier with the first tract of land. So that is how Polly and Angel became the owners of the best land. So my family is struggling to become landowners, and I wanted to show you these illustrations from a 19th century local history book illustrating the typical pioneer experience. But I do want to point out this is a very idealized version of what that experience was, and it also very noticeably contains no natives in it, even though they're very much present. So this illustration shows the settler clearing, making a clearing in the forest, building a log cabin. The next one shows that he has built a garden next to his cabin. He has cleared some land and built a kind of rough bridge across the stream. You also see that his livestock runs free. This is something the Oneidas complained about, because the livestock of settlers was running free meant that they trampled through the Oneida fields, they destroyed Oneida crops. And this was a serious concern for the Oneidas, because by this time their hunting grounds were much reduced. They could no longer rely on combining hunting with farming to feed themselves. And so the loss of crops was causing hunger among the Oneidas. Okay, I'm not sure my family ever made it to this step in pioneer progress. From the records that I have found, they tended to be unable to pay the mortgages on their land, and it was foreclosed, and many of them ended up as tenant farmers, so farming somebody else's land rather than their own. But in this step, you see that the settler has built a frame house next to his log cabin. He has an orchard, barns, cleared fields. There's now an actual road in front of his house and a bridge. And there's a mill on the stream. I did run across a journal kept by a German traveler who noted that when the Oneidas sold their land, they asked that the trees along certain streams not be cut down, because if the trees along the stream banks prevented erosion, and that preserved the fishing. But settlers ignored that. They cut down the trees, the streams filled up with sediment, and the fishing declined. So that left the Oneidas even hungrier. And what that meant was that when they faced famine in certain years, and needed to buy food for the people, the only thing they had of value to sell was land. So this is another example of the kind of pressure on the Oneidas to part with their precious territory. The final sign of progress was to have quite a stately home, as you can see, a far cry from the log cabin, several barns, many cleared fields, and if you notice in the background, there is a train going through. So what's ironic to me about this is it's not at all represent my family. This represents Polly's family, because Polly ended up having a very comfortable and gracious life in old age with the train running through her backyard. Now the train, the canal, the Genesee Road brought thousands and thousands of people through Oneida Territory. Most moved on to the west, but some stayed and settled. And while this was happening, the federal and state government was carrying out the policy known as Indian removal, where they were moving, sometimes by force, sometimes by pressure, sometimes by persuasion, natives to the west. During this time, groups of Oneidas left their homeland. They moved to Wisconsin, they moved to Canada, and those who remained were called the Home Party. So by 1840, the Oneidas had about 800 acres of land left in Madison County and also a small reservation in Oneida County. And on that reservation, the Oneidas had very prosperous farms. They established one of the first Methodist churches in the area, and they had schools. And according to the census, the home of Chief Christian Beechtree and also the home of Becky's great-great-grandfather was a much nicer farm than the one of my ancestor who lived next door. So my ancestors and the Oneidas are all living side by side on this remaining territory. By 1875, the reservation is no longer marked on the map, although it is still there. So you see there's the Indian church, the Indian school, a number of Oneida families live there, but it is not identified on the map. Now the state had required that the Oneidas who remained on their ancestral land, the Home Party, that they must own their property as individuals, not communally as a tribe, as they always had done. And this made their land more vulnerable to fraud and foreclosures. The Oneidas complained about the illegal takeover of the land reserved to them. And the state responded by saying that the Oneidas must assimilate or live like white people, or as officials put it, become civilized. So this was a time when the state closed down the Oneida schools, and several Oneida children were sent to boarding schools, and some were sent to public school. So this is a picture of a school near the reservation. This is Becky's grandfather, Lyman John, and this is Polly's great-great-niece, Lizzie Shenandoah. Around this time, Polly's grandchildren decided they needed a tenant farmer to farm their land, and they hired my great-grandfather. So my grandfather, DeVerne, and his brother and sister were born in the tenant house on the best land. Around the time this picture was taken, the Brewers bought the farm from Polly's grandchildren, and so that's how my family became the owners of the best land. At the same time, my family was achieving this generations-long goal of becoming landowners. The Oneidas were in danger of losing the last bit of their ancestral territory. So it was the 32 acres left on the reservation of 1840. It was the home of Mary Hanyost Scannadoa, who had, in the tradition of the Oneidas, inherited her land from the women of her family. She and her family were evicted following a case involving a disputed mortgage, and Mary and her family fought this eviction in court. So this is a picture of them at the courthouse. So you can see Mary here, and this is her brother Nick, who is Dick's great-great-grandfather. So there's a lot of ancestors for all of us today. In a rare and significant victory, the Oneidas won the case. The judge said that according to federal law, the state did not have the power to terminate the tribe and that the land belonged to the Oneidas. So in the decades that followed, several Oneida families moved to the 32 acres, their federally recognized reservation. In the 1960s, they sent a petition to New York State asking for funds to reestablish a reservation of about 10,000 acres and to finance housing, industry, and the preservation of their ancient culture. In this petition, the Oneidas reminded state officials that since 1634, when the Dutchman Harman van den Bogart explored their homeland, there had been no conflict between our peoples. This petition and others were rejected, and the Oneidas decided to pursue their land claims cases through the courts. So this newspaper article from the 1970s references a land claims case involving the 100 acres set aside for the home party. So this photo of the 32-acre reservation on the lower right shows the trailers that the Oneidas lived in that had been provided by the federal government, which emphasizes this idea that they were sort of transitory, that they were not permanent. While the farm pictured above is described as belonging to the farmer for 3 decades, really emphasizing the permanence of his home and farm. And it quotes the farmer asking, "How would you feel if everything you had in the world for most of your life might be taken from you?" And I think this article illustrates the prevailing sympathy for local landowners at the time. Few people seem to realize that the Oneidas already knew how it felt to have what they most valued taken from them. So my father, a dairy farmer who was the part-time mayor of Oneida when the Oneidas successfully launched their land claims cases, knew, I think, even less about the Oneidas than his ancestor Harman van den Bogart. He did not know that Polly's grandparents had helped his ancestors to survive their first winter in the Schoharie Valley. He did not know that Oneida men and women had protected his family during the American Revolution. He did not know that his forefathers were squatters who had benefited from the dispossession of the Oneidas. As I look back on the confusion and tragedy that took place 50 years ago, I wonder, what if my father had known the story of his family and the Oneidas? I believe that the history he knew left him at a loss. So in the early 2000s, there had been a significant reversal of fortunes, as illustrated by the front page of our local paper, the Oneida Dispatch. So you can see our farm is pictured here. Like many farms during the national farm crisis was sold. Also, this is the same time the upstate economy was facing hard times because of the decline of manufacturing jobs. And for Oneida, the closure of the Oneida Community Limited, which manufactured silverware, was a blow. So the city wanted to attract industry by selling our farm for manufacturing, and was emphasizing its convenience to the railroad and the thruway. Again, that its location made it an attractive site. Now, while at the same time, the Oneida Indian Nation was using the profits it had made from bingo games to buy back land. And it had built the Turning Stone Casino just off the thruway in Verona, and it had become the major employer in the area. The story below the article about our farm, or the best land, talks about Oneida Nation representatives going to the White House and meeting President George W. Bush, who issued an order instructing federal agencies to respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination. This was also a time of heightened tension over the land claims. And it was a time when a group called Upstate Citizens for Equality picketed at Oneida-owned businesses, waving American flags. So it seemed like my hometown was being divided over whose history got to be heard and respected. And it was a time when neighbors disagreed, sometimes in hateful ways, over who belonged and who did not. 11 years ago, the Oneida Indian Nation negotiated a gaming compact with New York State that has laid to rest the land claims for the time being. Conflicted feelings remain, along with degrees of division and reconciliation. So what I found is that the story of the best land is many stories, and it is full of twists and turns. So it's the story of how our ancestors, Polly's, Becky's, Dick's, and mine, struggled to navigate the times in which they lived. They made good decisions and bad, and behaved with generosity and bravery and greed, just like human beings do. But I think they tried to do the best they could for their families. The Best Land is also the story of corruption and deceit and betrayal. It is a story of how Native people have been erased from maps and history books. It is the story of how the Oneidas persevered for generations in their effort to persuade the United States to uphold its own laws. And it is the story of two families, Polly's and mine, who loved the place they called home and whose histories have been intertwined for 400 years. Thank you.
Given the amount of omission in the history, how were you able to discover as much as you did?
Well, it took a very long time. I had help. And I think you just keep digging. You know, there are lots of dead ends, lots of bits and pieces. So you can just, I just put together what I could, and and that's really all anybody can do, because there's so much missing from the record, as well as there's so much to find if you just keep digging. So I think that, you know, I did a lot of research at local historical societies, the New York State Archives. I read a lot of treaties, and I read a lot of deeds at the county courthouses here in Oneida County and in Madison County. And if you've ever read those old deeds, there's a lot of sneezing involved. And that handwriting, you know, just to try to figure out, and, you know, then to trace, okay, so this boundary went from the beech tree to the big rock, you know, that sort of stuff. My family drove around with me all over the place. My niece Holly and I were once driving, trying to use a map from 1875 to find places. This very nice man came up to us, so we were parked in the car staring at the map saying, "Are you lost?" And we said, "In 1875, we're lost." So, you know, it was all that, and just meeting amazing people along the way who, you know, shared their information with me, and got excited about the quest to find out as much as we could.
I absolutely admire you for what you have done for the people in New York State. Because there's so many people who still talk and they don't have a clue.
Oh, thank you, Becky. Oh. Yes, I showed up at Becky's house with donuts, but we got so excited about all the Oneida families we were tracing that the donuts got buried under paper and notebooks, and we never got a chance to eat them, because this shows you how just thrilled we were to be talking about all these things. And so, you know, Becky says sometimes about all of this history that you have to laugh or else you cry. And I think that in part the Oneidas have a very dark sense of humor. But I think that there is this very profound emotional side to this story. And I think because I focused on the families, it's easier to connect to it. It doesn't, because I think everyone can relate to family stories here.
Dr. Brewer, on behalf of all of us, thank you for your talk. Thank you for your research. It's a fascinating slice that you don't always hear. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much.